Hello and welcome to St. Peter Lutheran Church here in Walburg, Texas. We're so glad you can join us today. A few announcements as we get started. Last week, my father preached for us, and this week I'm back. It's good to be back as we start this season of Advent. Advent's a unique time in the church year. First off, it's the very beginning of the church year. I often find it funny that as a pastor, I have to hold all sorts of different calendars in my mind. For one thing, the Christian calendar, but also the yearly calendar that we use in our day-to-day lives. But this is the beginning of the church year, and Advent is a special time of preparedness. Now, it's preparedness in a unique way, a different way. It shares a lot of similarities with the season of Lent. Lent, we prepare for Jesus Christ's atoning act, that central and crucial part, literally crucial part of the Christian message, the gospel, where Christ dies on the cross and rises again to be the first fruits of the resurrection. Advent, however, looks back to the season of waiting, as God's people, first off, await his birth, his appearing. And second off, as we wait for his second coming, his reappearing. In fact, that's what today's lesson will be about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Advent is also the time of year where we prepare the church for Christmas. And as such, this Sunday at 9 a.m., we invite you to come and assist us in decorating the church. We hope that with numerous people assisting, we'll be able to get finished with this very quickly, and it usually does go very quickly. Also, we want to remember all the things that happened just this past week and this past year. We thank especially Elaine and the people in the outreach committee for helping to put together and organize our Thanksgiving meal. It was truly a joy to see all the people come here, people who maybe couldn't get to family, like my wife and my daughter and myself, but also people who wanted to be part of the community and were looking for another Thanksgiving meal. It truly is wonderful to celebrate the family of God in that particular way. And ironically, in a time and a place where we have so much to be thankful for, it's odd that we aren't as thankful as maybe we should be. I also want to thank Jerry for fixing the turkey, and I want to thank everyone else for bringing food. It was certainly wonderful. And my wife and I appreciated the leftovers that were sent home with the three of us. In addition, we will be having several new classes coming up, new discussion groups. We'll have a discussion group on the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That will start sometime after the new year. We're also hoping to get to work on some other explorations of the Bible. One exploration is exactly how the Old Testament fits in with the world in its time, and we'll be gathering together to look over that. We'll also be gathering together to look over the book of Revelation sometime beyond that, which seems appropriate for Revelation, doesn't it? Anyway, that is an often misunderstood book. It's a book where we have to shift our focus away from ourselves and away from this world. Otherwise, we will be led to despair, which is its point. But if we pin our hopes upon Christ, the book of Revelation is a hopeful book, as injustice and unrighteousness, sin and the separation of God, and even death itself are swallowed up and disappear forever. The fact that Revelation causes so much distress in people's lives demonstrates perhaps that the church has not done the best job in exploring this amazing book. So we hope that you'll join us for those things, and we will keep you up to date as information comes about when we can start. Unfortunately, this past couple of years has definitely been a time of waiting and listening to see exactly what we can and can't do safely. But I think as we kind of move forward, we can explore this time of being church. So, without further ado, let's worship our Lord. The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 21st chapter. Jesus said, "And there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the seas and the waves. People fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." And he told them this parable. "Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that summer is already near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with the dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man." The word of the Lord. Happy New Year. This is the first Sunday of the church year, this time of anticipation. There are a lot of ways we can get muddled, though, in this time. Advent has become a sort of prologue to the Christmas season. And while that is what the church has decided that the Advent season should be, unfortunately, I think what happens is we see a bit of the Christmas creep. Some people have that Christmas creep of joyfulness to the point where joy becomes mandatory. Happiness becomes mandatory. And so any talk about the cares and the problems that we face in this world is considered an affront. On the other hand, there are people who seem to dwell on being opinion givers at this time, replacing the gifts under the tree with opinions of their own crafting. I was recently reminded of that. I've been reminded over and over again as various church bodies and various churches and pastors offer opinions firmly rooted in their own cultural clique. Indeed, one of the main reasons for me joining my current denomination was I got tired of people making opinions devoid of relationship. And yet, when I tried to rush over maybe to the other extreme or was tempted to do so, I found those same things. In fact, in today's very polarized world, I couldn't help but notice that the people on both sides of the chasm of my social media were screaming at each other. You know, folks, when you actually talk to our neighbors. For those of you who are Christians out there, faithful believers, this is for you. For those of you who are not, you can listen in. We hear you. For the people who don't come to church or are appalled by the church, I think what really drives them nuts is the fact that we seem to offer very worldly opinions with a religious or pharisaical veneer. In fact, in the recent problems that our country has faced, many secular people have stated that the problem they have with Christianity is the fact that we only seem to show up when we can kind of harangue and give advice to people. We don't participate in the daily lives and daily needs of our community. And that is what I found recently as I read the news this week. So if the church has become this, what are we to do? What are we to offer that's so different than the world around us? Indeed, what makes our message so distinct from all of the other worldly messages? We have many new avenues and different ways of spreading news. Anyone can get on their soapbox these days. What is it that we have to say that is unique? Indeed, what earns us a right to be heard? And I think our gospel lesson answers that question. There will always be temptations to go off script. But I think the world is yearning to hear our better story. Jesus here is talking to the people who are facing cataclysmic problems in their own lives. And Jesus' declaration is that it will only get worse. He lays out this proclamation in three various ways, three different paragraphs, components. The first one deals with the signs. The second one are a series of stories. And the final one is a warning against self-satisfaction. So signs, stories, and self-satisfaction. Now our story picks up where we left off 2 weeks ago. My father was preaching here last week, and before that I was preaching from the Gospel of Mark. This section in Mark and Matthew and Luke is called Jesus' little apocalypse. Here he predicts the destruction of the world and the rebuilding on a firmer foundation. Jesus goes into detail in explaining the ways in which people get muddled about the apocalypse. Remember what we said just the other week about how the true danger of the apocalypse is to read only ourselves or this present moment into the statement which the Bible is trying to make. Instead, our focus should be firmly upon Christ and upon his promises, for that is the statement which he is trying to make. The first set of terrors is that of the signs of heaven and earth. I fear too often that when people read this passage, we tend to take it too selfishly. And when we look at things too selfishly, man, we can become legalistic nitpickers, can't we? Have you ever dealt with a small child trying to persuade you of something? They can quote to you chapter and verse some offhanded comment that you've made. Here we tend to read this too literally because we want to be in control at all times. But the point is that we are out of control. Now, as Jesus makes these pronouncements, of course, we can give in to fear. What does he mean? What is this going to look like? And we should be asking, what would our reaction be to seeing such signs and portents? What would it look like if the lodestar and foundation of our lives, the central aspect of our identity, had somehow or in some way been catastrophically removed. Until very recently, of course, gazing upon the heavens was considered to be the surest way of planning for the future. Concurrently, the sea was the primordial chaos that was always lapping at the very shores of creation. So Jesus' double terror here lays out that on one hand, the sure and steady reassurance of stability was cast down. And on the other hand, the void will race into the lives and communities of the people. What could Jesus possibly mean by all of these declarations? For many people, this is a prediction of the future. And while that may be, Jesus himself tells us not to worry about trying to read the tea leaves of his return, just to be faithful. Instead, I think we need to remember just where Jesus is. There in the shadow of the temple on the Mount of Olivet, that place that was where God was told by many people that God was going to return for this last judgment. There on Olivet, Jesus looks at the temple. The temple, that cornerstone and foundation of the very identity of the congregation of God. Those people called out from the wilderness, who carried with them the tabernacle, who built the temples. That temple was going to be destroyed. And the Romans were going to do it. In 66 to 73 AD, the cataclysmic battles would occur, and the temple itself would be undone. The loss of such stability would have been bad enough, but Jesus here states the total chaos that will emerge. Remember, the temple was not just a building. It was the very beating heart of the congregation of Israel. Laws, so many laws, were tied up in the rituals and ordinance of the temple, and now Jesus' proclamation that it will be undone would have been terrifying. Our own headlines today tell us what happens when stability is actually removed in a community. And it seems to put to rest the easy answers, though, of the pundits and the Christian bureaucrats. That somehow hope in this life can be found. Hope in this life can truly satisfy us. What happens when the wolves are at the door? Jesus does not deny the loss of certainty and anxiety that will emerge. However, God is not done with them yet. For they will see the Son of Man descending from the clouds. And here Jesus is clearly referencing Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, and its terrible pronouncement of how the true representative of humanity, the Son of Man, will stand before the throne of the Creator of time and pass judgment upon each and every human soul. Before the Ancient of Days, whose heart we broke in our rebellion, stands the Son of Man. Looking upon this vision, only a crazy person would not be undone by its pronouncement. And yet, into this, Christ throws a monkey wrench. He admonishes his people that they should raise up their heads because the collapse of the sad and sorry world is finally here, and their redemption is very much at hand. Now, without missing a beat, Christ moves into the parable of the trees and their leaves and springtime. It is important to note just what is going on here. If we are to think about the apocalypse as the world thinks about the apocalypse, we only think of the end because that's where our hopes rest. They rest firmly in a visible world which will surely melt away. But for the Christian whose roots delve deeper into the dawn of time, indeed the creation before the dawn of time, the apocalypse is merely the last frost before the rays of spring cover the land with light and warmth and life. It's interesting to note when we read the Bible just how it uses trees as metaphors. Trees themselves have no decision about bringing forth good fruit and bearing leaves. Instead, they merely react to where they have been planted. One gets the feeling that trees don't choose to bear good fruit, but bear good fruit because they have life in them, as Luke himself records in chapter 6, verse 43. But how does one get to be filled with this life? How does one send down the taproots into living water? Psalm 1 tells us in the 3rd verse, he, that is the Christian or the disciple, is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. Jeremiah 17:8 declares, he is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and it's not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. Of course, we know that the living water is this Jesus, as John 4:14 and John 7:37 tells us. But meanwhile, after all, in Revelation 21:6, we hear this declared from the throne. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega. One can easily imagine I am the Ancient of Days, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Learn from the trees who wait through the winter of the world, waiting to burst forth into life when glorious spring has finally arrived and has completed its revolution. In our fear, we can listen to the siren's call of public displays of social solidarity or personal piety. But the only thing that will bring us true life is being planted by the spring of living water. We come now to the warning against self-satisfaction. The real danger that Jesus wants his disciples to be mindful of is their temptation to simply melt away. He tells them to watch themselves. Now, this Greek word, prosakete, means to stick close to, and one is reminded of the old film noir, where the hero tails the villain or a person of suspicious attributes. Jesus tells us that this person is our sinful selves, and this sinful self is always going to try and give us the slip. He lays out 3 ways that he can do this. Firstly, by enjoying the company of people, content or complacent about the state of the world. Secondly, by trying to dull our sense of this holy unease about the fallen world. Or we can go in the opposite direction, which is worrying too much about the cares of the world. All of them are focused on our bellies. All of them look for worldly answers instead of the only answer from outside the world that will truly satisfy. Giving into the way the world sorts out the problem of God's judgment will ultimately lead to being trapped in it. The key is to remember that our identities as disciples, no matter how the world tries to fog that vision, it's easy for that vision to get cloudy And we can get tempted to offer our very worldly opinions to the problems in this world. But friends, the world isn't looking for those answers. They're not looking for answers that emerge from a world winding down. They're looking for something truly different. They're looking for a sure hope from the one who has come from outside of the world in order to rescue it. Here Christ lays out the signs, the stories, and the self-satisfaction that the world has on offer. And against these things, he places himself as the sure salvation, standing in front of the throne of God and proclaiming that the judgment of God will fall on him if we let it. This is why at the end of the chapter we are told, and every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. Friends, we do not always need to have an opinion about every headline, just as we do not need to feel that the mark of faith is to shrug off the needs of our neighbors. Instead, in the midst of the constant crises of a world that feels unmoored, we proclaim the good news that God has no desire to leave us alone and wishes to stand with us at the end of all things. The story of the gospel is that Christ is so engaging that whatever the stories the world tries to share, no matter how fleeting, they will pass away. But his words, his promises, his gospel, those will never pass away, no matter what befalls us in this life. Amen.